There are moments in neighborhood life that feel so bizarre you almost question if they're real. At first, everything seems normal: quiet streets, manicured lawns, and the faint hum of lawnmowers echoing on Saturday mornings. But then, out of nowhere, one person decides to turn ordinary life into a twisted spectacle. That's exactly what happened to me. It began with something as simple as gardening and ended with fake detectives, police tape, and my yard being labeled a so-called crime scene. At first glance, my neighborhood looked peaceful, the kind of place where people nod politely as they pass by, and the HOA claims to keep things running smoothly. But beneath the calm surface was an undercurrent of pettiness, mostly fueled by one person: Karen. She was the type of neighbor who thrived on stirring chaos. If someone left their trash bins out an hour too long, she'd report it. If a car was parked slightly off-center, she'd complain. And if a homeowner dared to plant something she didn't approve of, she would unleash her full wrath. For a while, I tried to ignore her antics. Everyone warned me she was the self-proclaimed watchdog of the block, and her alliance with the HOA made her feel untouchable. She strutted around like a sheriff without a badge, carrying a clipboard and snapping photos of anything she considered wrong. I knew she had targeted others before, but I never expected she would set her sights on me over something as harmless as gardening. It all started the day I decided to redo my front yard. I'd been planning for weeks: new flowers, a vegetable patch, and some decorative stones to edge the walkway. The soil was fresh, the tools laid out, and I was excited to finally bring some life and color into the space. But as soon as Karen spotted me digging, her face twisted like I was committing some unspeakable crime. By that evening, I noticed yellow tape stretched across a portion of my yard. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank by kids. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't ordinary tape. It was printed with the words, "Crime Scene. Do not cross." My jaw dropped. My yard, my simple gardening project, was now marked off as if a felony had taken place. At first I laughed, assuming it was some twisted joke. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Karen standing with her phone, recording every second of my reaction. Her smug expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't random. This was her doing. By the next morning, things escalated even further. Two men in trench coats appeared on my lawn, wearing sunglasses and pretending to take notes. They walked around, snapping photos of the soil, crouching near my plants like they were collecting evidence, and whispering dramatically. My stomach sank when I realized Karen was orchestrating this bizarre charade. These weren't detectives. They were clearly just her friends, roped into her scheme to make my yard look like the center of some investigation. Neighbors began to gather, murmuring in confusion. Some even looked concerned, wondering if something serious had happened. That was exactly what Karen wanted: fear, gossip, and suspicion. To her, my gardening wasn't just a project. It was her latest chance to dominate the neighborhood narrative. I tried to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. Cameras pointed at my house. Karen stood proudly with a folder tucked under her arm, as if she was the lead investigator. And the HOA board members? They didn't step in to stop it. In fact, I caught one of them chatting with Karen, nodding as if her antics were somehow legitimate. It felt like I was surrounded, trapped in a reality show I never agreed to join. The craziest part? Karen actually filed a complaint, claiming I had disturbed soil that could contain dangerous evidence of illegal activity. That was her justification for the fake crime scene. It was so absurd that I almost couldn't believe it was happening. But when I received a letter taped to my door with the HOA logo on it, stating my gardening was under review, the situation turned from laughable to infuriating. The gossip spread like wildfire. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel the eyes of neighbors on me, wondering if my yard really was some kind of crime scene. I knew if I didn't put an end to it soon, Karen's fabricated drama would stain my reputation in the neighborhood. But I wasn't about to play her game. Instead of lashing out, I quietly installed cameras around my property. If Karen wanted to stage a show, I would capture every second of her performance in high definition. Little did she know, her carefully staged production was about to backfire spectacularly, and this was only the beginning. When most people think of neighborhood disputes, they imagine petty arguments about fences, noisy dogs, or maybe parking spots. What happened in my case went far beyond that. Karen had already turned my yard into her personal stage, branding it as a crime scene and parading her fake detectives around like we were in the middle of some true crime documentary. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't just standing back, helplessly watching. I was documenting everything. The cameras I installed weren't obvious. I placed them strategically, tucked behind a gutter, camouflaged in a garden ornament, and one hidden under the porch light. Each had a perfect angle of my yard, the street, and most importantly, Karen's so-called investigations. I knew if she escalated, I would need undeniable proof of her fabrications. It didn't take long before the cameras paid off. The very next afternoon, I spotted Karen returning with her fake detectives. They strutted onto my lawn like actors rehearsing for a low-budget crime show, adjusting their sunglasses and nodding seriously at each other. One of them carried a cheap magnifying glass, holding it over my flower bed like he was examining fingerprints. Another scribbled nonsense in a notepad, pausing dramatically before glancing toward Karen for approval. Karen, of course, basked in the spotlight. She directed them with sweeping gestures, pointing to random patches of dirt, instructing them where to search. It was clear she wanted the neighborhood to believe something sinister had happened on my property. She even made a show of stringing up more crime scene tape, wrapping it tightly around my mailbox and across my driveway. Neighbors stopped to watch, some whispering nervously, others rolling their eyes at the ridiculous performance. But whether they believed it or not didn't matter to Karen. What mattered was attention, and she was getting plenty of it. The cameras, though, caught every detail her performance tried to hide. They picked up her phone screen as she texted instructions to the so-called detectives. They recorded the moment one of them tripped over his own shoelace and laughed, completely breaking character before Karen snapped at him to stay serious. And most damning of all, they captured her staging evidence. Late one evening, when she thought no one was watching, Karen crept onto my yard with a small plastic bag. She knelt near the flower bed and buried something in the soil. The next morning, during her dramatic investigation, one of her fake detectives conveniently discovered the bag and held it up like it contained damning proof. Karen gasped, placing her hand over her mouth as though she was uncovering a shocking crime. The footage made it crystal clear. This wasn't just harassment. It was a fully staged production designed to humiliate me. When I reviewed the footage that night, a mix of anger and relief washed over me. Anger, because Karen was bold enough to trespass and plant fake evidence on my property. Relief, because now I had everything I needed to expose her lies. But before I could reveal the truth, things escalated again.
A few days later,
I received an official-looking letter taped to my front door. The HOA demanded I halt all landscaping projects until further notice, citing potential hazards and contamination concerns. They claimed my yard had become a matter of investigation. It was obvious Karen had lobbied hard behind the scenes, feeding them her fabricated story until they treated it like fact. Now, it wasn't just my reputation on the line, it was my ability to live peacefully in my own home. If the HOA sided with Karen completely, they could fine me, restrict my property use, or worse, escalate to legal threats. And all of it would be based on lies. But I wasn't panicking. I knew patience was my greatest weapon. With every day that passed, my cameras continued to capture more evidence of Karen's ridiculous theatrics. One night, she returned yet again with her crew. This time, they wore cheap plastic badges clipped to their shirts, clearly bought online. They posed for photos, flashing their fake IDs as though they were undercover agents. Karen strutted alongside them, whispering loudly enough for neighbors to hear that she was working closely with investigators. To anyone who looked closer, it was laughable, but for those who didn't, it painted me as the villain of the block. The next morning, I woke up to find another escalation. A giant, hand-painted sign staked into my yard. In bold red letters it read, "Under investigation, keep out." It looked like something from a high school art project, sloppy brushstrokes and uneven letters, but it did the job. Neighbors walking by crossed to the other side of the street. Cars slowed down to stare. The image of my yard as a so-called crime scene was spreading beyond just the block. That was the final straw. I compiled the footage into a neat timeline. Karen planting evidence, directing her fake detectives, staging photos, and trespassing repeatedly. The video showed everything: her smug expressions, her exaggerated gasps, her friends breaking character when they forgot their roles. It was undeniable proof of her staged drama, but instead of sending it straight to the HOA, I held on to it. I wanted Karen to dig her hole even deeper before I delivered the knockout blow. And dig she did. A week later, Karen hosted a community meeting on the sidewalk, gathering neighbors to update them on the investigation. She waved around printed photos of the fake detectives on my lawn, claiming she had evidence of disturbing activity in my soil. She urged people to pressure the HOA into taking immediate action against me. Some neighbors looked skeptical, but others, swayed by her theatrics, nodded in agreement. I stayed inside, watching from my window, my cameras rolling as always. I knew the perfect moment to strike was coming. And then it arrived. Karen made her boldest move yet. She called the local police. Not her fake detectives this time, the actual police. She wanted them to show up and validate her claims. When the squad car pulled up in front of my house, neighbors gathered like it was the climax of a soap opera. Karen greeted the officers eagerly, pointing dramatically toward my yard. She spoke animatedly, gesturing to the fake crime scene tape and insisting something sinister was buried in my garden. I held my breath, watching from inside as the officers walked across my lawn, inspecting the area. They looked skeptical from the start, clearly unconvinced by the amateur theatrics. But Karen pressed harder, demanding they dig up the soil and confiscate evidence. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I stepped outside with a calm expression, a USB drive in my hand. On it was every second of footage the cameras had captured. What happened next would change everything. The moment the police stepped onto my yard, Karen's face lit up with triumph. To her, this was the final act of her carefully staged drama, the moment the real authorities would validate her fantasy and turn my garden into a genuine investigation. She hovered close to the officers, pointing to the fake crime scene tape, the staged sign, and the carefully disturbed patches of soil. Neighbors crowded along the sidewalk, whispering and waiting for the spectacle to unfold. But what Karen didn't know was that the real show was about to begin, and this time she wasn't the director. The officers listened patiently as she rattled off her accusations, their expressions growing more doubtful with every word. She insisted that evidence was buried in my yard, claimed that strange activities had taken place, and tried to parade her stack of photos as proof. But the photos, grainy snapshots of her fake detectives crouching dramatically, only made her sound less credible. One officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. That was my moment. I stepped forward, calm and collected, holding the USB drive containing weeks of footage. I explained that I had cameras installed around my property, and I had captured everything Karen had done. The officers immediately perked up, asking if they could review the footage. Karen's confident smile faltered. For the first time in weeks, she looked uncertain. Inside my house, I set up the footage on a laptop while the officers leaned in to watch. Karen tried to hover behind them, but I noticed her shifting uncomfortably as the truth unraveled in front of their eyes. The first clip showed her planting the plastic bag in my flower bed, crouching low in the dark with a flashlight. The next revealed her texting instructions to her detectives, then directing them like an amateur film producer during the staged investigation. Another clip showed her friends breaking character, laughing as they posed with their fake badges, and Karen snapping at them to stay serious. The officers' expressions went from neutral to incredulous. They saw her staging every piece of so-called evidence, trespassing on my property, and fabricating the entire story. And finally, the footage of her hand-painted "under investigation" signs sealed it. This wasn't a crime scene, it was theater. When the last clip ended, the room was silent, except for the faint noise of the crowd outside. The officers exchanged glances, then turned to Karen. She sputtered excuses, claiming it was all for the safety of the neighborhood, but her words rang hollow. The proof was undeniable. Outside, neighbors waited anxiously for the verdict. When the officers stepped back onto the lawn, Karen tried to regain control of the narrative, shouting that she had done her civic duty. But the officers quickly shut her down, informing the crowd that there was no investigation, no evidence, and certainly no crime scene. Instead, they explained that Karen had staged everything, wasting everyone's time and resources. The reaction from the neighbors was immediate. Gasps, groans, and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized the extent of her lies. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others glared at Karen, their patience with her antics finally snapping. For weeks, she had dragged the neighborhood into her drama, and now, exposed under the weight of undeniable footage, her credibility shattered. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. She tried to argue with the officers, insisting the footage was edited or taken out of context. But the more she protested, the more ridiculous she sounded. The officers calmly explained that she could face consequences for filing false reports, trespassing, and harassment. That was when the smug expression completely drained from her face, and just like that, the self-proclaimed detective of the block had become the prime suspect in her own scandal. The HOA, which had been silent up until now, quickly scrambled to distance themselves. Within days, I received another letter, but this one was very different from the last. Instead of restrictions, it was an apology. They claimed they had been misled by inaccurate reports and assured me that my gardening project could continue without interference. Of course, they didn't admit their own failure to question Karen's claims in the first place, but at least they were backing down. The best part? My footage didn't just vindicate me, it spread. Several neighbors asked to see the video, and when they did, the laughter was unstoppable. Watching Karen's over-the-top performances, her fake detectives fumbling through their roles, and the ridiculous crime scene tape unraveling in the wind, turned her serious accusations into a neighborhood comedy reel. Word spread quickly, and before long, Karen was the punchline of every backyard barbecue and casual conversation on the block. Her reign of intimidation was over. People stopped taking her complaints seriously. The HOA grew cautious about backing her ever again, and her detectives, they vanished, probably too embarrassed to show their faces after being exposed on camera. As for my garden, it thrived. The flowers bloomed, the vegetable patch grew strong, and the decorative stones lined the walkway just as I had envisioned. Every time I watered the plants, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of Karen declaring the soil a crime scene. The same soil now grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and bright marigolds, mocking her claims with every new sprout. Looking back, it still amazes me how quickly something so innocent spiraled into chaos. All I wanted was to plant a garden, but in Karen's world, that became an opportunity to stage a fake investigation and turn the neighborhood upside down. But in the end, her obsession with control was her downfall. The cameras caught everything she never wanted exposed, and the truth stripped away her power. To this day, whenever I see yellow tape fluttering in the breeze, whether in a movie or on the news, I can't help but laugh. Because I'll never forget the time my neighbor tried to brand my yard as a crime scene, only to have her scheme collapse under the weight of her own lies. And if there's one lesson I took from it all, it's this. When faced with a Karen, don't argue, don't stoop to their level, just let the cameras roll. Because eventually, the footage speaks louder than any accusation they can dream up. That's how I turned the most ridiculous neighborhood scandal into the sweetest victory.